Hello everybody, it's Jade, and this week we are beginning our coverage of Star Trek's edgiest season, Star Trek Enterprise Season 3. This season we are dealing with a whole lot of brand new elements like the military, cold-blooded torture, genocide, actually we've dealt with that one before, but raising a child just to sacrifice it for the sake of the mission, and other absolutely delightful tonal changes that pretty much split people's opinions on this season of Enterprise. This is going to be an extra stuffed episode today. I made the decision, and you will understand why as we proceed through this episode, to go through the first 10 episodes of Season 3 instead of the first 8 like I thought I would. I wanted to be able to get to a stopping point that I felt satisfied with regarding a lot of the new elements that have been added in this season. Because of that, this episode is probably going to be very long. So let's get started. Overall, this season is very different. The main cause for this is that at this point, Enterprise was struggling really hard in the numbers. We talked a couple of weeks ago about how after a night in sickbay, the numbers dropped and they were never able to be picked back up. However, the network still obviously wanted to try to save the show. Star Trek was an extremely successful brand and they were going to do whatever they thought they could in order to make Enterprise successful. They had tried a couple of things, such as making it hornier, and that didn't seem to be working, so they decided to do a complete tonal, thematic, structural rewrite to the entire series, with the idea being that this new formula would invite viewers to begin watching again. Unfortunately, this was not successful due to a variety of reasons that are easier to understand in hindsight. However, that doesn't mean that Season 3 is bad. If anything, Season 3 is an attempt to make Enterprise better in order to get people to watch it. Now, many of the changes are not better, or are neutral, shall we say. And whether or not it improves the series is largely up to personal preference. But we're basically telling a new story at this point, and personally I think it's sorely needed. I really enjoyed Season 1. Season 1 told almost a complete story in some of its character arcs. It introduced a bunch of characters, and it told the story of how Archer and T'Pol came to be able to work together to lead a starship. A very small story in and of itself. It didn't tell the whole story of the creation of the Federation or anything, but Season 1 had clear direction and clear things that they wanted to achieve by the end of the season. Season 2 had more episodes that were better than the average Season 1 episode. However, overall, Season 2 really started to feel a little bit directionless. I wouldn't cut Season 2. I don't think there's anything majorly wrong with Season 2 outside of a couple of individual episodes that I didn't like. However, I do think that it's fortunate at this point that they decided to change things up. Another season like Season 2 would have probably been very stale. So the direction that Enterprise took was tackling the topic of 9/11. At this point, the network at least perceived American audiences as not really wanting a silly, fun time. They wanted something that would address the actual emotions that people were feeling. So the attack on Florida is a paper-thin allegory for the attack on the World Trade Center, and the arc of Season 3 deals with a whole lot of factors to the reaction to 9/11. We see individual people's reactions to things that happened. We see the way the ship changes. We see what humanity thinks we should be doing about this. There are, of course, individual episode plots that are very reminiscent of the rest of Star Trek and the previous 2 seasons of Enterprise. However, each of these episodes must contribute to the overall series arc of being in the Delta Quadrant, which is a very dangerous place, in order to try to find more information about the people who attacked Earth and are intending to attack it again. Because of this, Season 3 comes across as an angsty, militaristic revenge time some of the time. And while there are certainly some flashes of real brilliance regarding these emotions, a lot of times it can come across as being edgy for the sake of edge. Personally, I think that's okay. We're watching Star Trek. There was a poll on Tumblr a couple of weeks ago that asked, what is your preferred ratio of good to bad Star Trek episodes? And it was 100-0, 90-10, 80-20, and so on and so forth. I put 60-40. I don't want a bunch of bad episodes, but I think that bad episodes are important, and I miss bad episodes. I'm watching Strange New Worlds. It's great. I don't have any specific major complaints about Strange New Worlds, but Strange New Worlds is so short and so expensive. Every episode has to be devastatingly efficient. It has to do 5 or 6 different things. It has to do them perfectly. This is just personal preference. I prefer this type of storytelling where we have 24 episodes in a season. Each of them have an A, B, and maybe a C plot. Some of those individual plots might be crap, but it might overall contribute to the story or further someone's character development in the parts that aren't crap, or even in the parts that do suck. It's also shocking to me how much more similar Season 3 is to a modern TV show. I remember that when my family was watching Enterprise Season 3 for the first time, we all did not like the change from Season 2 to Season 3. However, watching it again, even though I actually remember Season 3 pretty well, the fact that it follows an actual story arc instead of being more episodic like Season 2 means that it was way easier for me to remember the general movements of how the season is supposed to go. Despite the fact that I remember not really liking Season 3, I found that Season 3 is much more similar to the way modern television is handled. A lot of the story decisions resemble modern television more than Season 2 and Season 1 did. Because of that, I actually think that I will end up liking Season 3 better on the second watch. There are certain elements that I didn't like the first time that I still don't like, or I still don't think I will like, but the format change I don't think is going to bother me or other viewers as much now. And I also think this contributes to why Enterprise is so beloved among Star Trek fans now. Some of these changes were not welcome when it first happened. The fact is that in 2003, tackling the topic of 9/11 was risky, no matter how well it's handled. For some people, tackling such a huge topic that takes up so much of the news cycle and so much of your mind is honest and something they wanted to be able to use to think about it. However, for others, the idea of one more show tackling the idea of 9/11 or not being able to turn off the news and watch something easy was not appealing. So while there was praise for certain aspects of this arc, there were a lot of people who simply didn't want to see this. So while Enterprise Season 3 is generally seen as an improvement in quality, that doesn't mean more people wanted to watch it when it was on. So Season 3 follows the story of Enterprise as it goes into the Delphic Expanse, which is basically the Bermuda Triangle of space. Weird shit happens there, very dangerous place. Everyone is out to get you, and supposedly the people who attacked Earth and intend to destroy it come from the Delphic Expanse. At this point in the first half or the first third, information is drip-fed to the audience about what exactly is going on with the Xindi. And the audience is expected to be thinking about what they think the Enterprise should do about these aliens. No one has given a specific solution to what should be done, especially in the first episode, when it's revealed that their planet has already been destroyed. The Xindi are not a people you can really go to war with. They're a scattered people who have long since stopped having an individual cultural identity. Well, they do have a bit of a cultural identity, but it's been 120 years since their planet was destroyed. No one currently alive was born there, and if you know one Xindi, that doesn't necessarily help you understand anything about any of the rest of them. There are other more obvious changes. There is now a military presence on Enterprise, actual soldiers who are there to protect the ship and be there in case they decide to go to war. There are a couple of new rooms on the ship. We see some situation rooms, places where Archer goes to plan and look at big charts. We get a lab, like a 2-person lab that Trip and T'Pol work in when they're being professional, and we see a whole lot of T'Pol's room when they are not being professional. We also see the inside of Trip's room at one point, which is a nice insight into his character. But we also see a bunch of new planets and new people. The places the ship visits in this season are very different from any of the other places they've visited. There are dingy markets and shady characters. In seasons 1 and 2, Enterprise was mostly dealing with either well-established civilized cultures with extremely Vulcan and or human sensibilities, or primitive people who were very reminiscent of early humanity. Now we are getting much more of a Star Wars Tatooine kind of feel everywhere we go. And there isn't much in the way of a positive governing body. Not that there was before, but even less so. But most importantly, this new season gives basically everyone on the crew a brand new story arc. The most obvious physical change among the crew is the transition from gray T'Pol to pink T'Pol. T'Pol stops being a member of the Vulcan High Command and instead is wearing civilian clothes. But this is sort of symbolic of one of the, what I would call, musical chairs that the cast participates in this season. At the beginning of the series, we were easily able to identify Archer, Trip, and T'Pol as the spirit, the heart, and the mind, respectively. But that's not how character development works, right? They can't just be the person they were in episode 1 forever. Archer is supposed to represent the human spirit. He is representing humanity's interest out in the expanse. The decisions that he comes to are supposed to be representative of what humanity would want and what would be best for Earth. However, in order to achieve that, he is becoming more like T'Pol. Dedicated to the mission, cold, calculating, and sometimes heartless. At least the T'Pol that we had at the beginning of the series. Pink T'Pol is a bit more compassionate and potentially even warm. She serves as a genuine source of support for multiple other members of the cast. And due to the situation with the anomalies in Trellium D, her safety is weighed against the safety of everyone else on the ship for basically the duration of this season. Trip, on the other hand, is becoming more like Archer was in season 1. Vaguely xenophobic because of the death of someone in his family, angry, short-sighted, and needing to learn a few lessons before he's able to be a good leader. On top of that, we've got a couple of other arcs. Phlox is in many episodes having to deal with some of the heavy moral quandaries that we see in these couple of episodes in a bit more of a personal way than we've had to see him deal with these in the past. The inclusion of the military means that Malcolm has some serious character development in store this season, although we haven't seen very much of it yet, due to the fact that he identifies as being this child of a military family, but he didn't actually go into the military, and now we have these real military types on board. It causes a bit of a power struggle between him and Major Hayes, a character whom we've seen a handful of times and I'm really excited to see more of. Please bring back my boy Enterprise. I would like to see him. I mean Malcolm. I don't really care about Hayes. I want more Malcolm. I mean, it would be nice to see Hayes. We don't know anything about him, though. But the final thing that I want to draw attention to before we dive into the individual episodes is the addition of Manny Coto. Manny Coto was a co-executive producer in season 3, well, beginning in season 3 of Enterprise, who eventually became the showrunner in season 4. You see, because of all of the total failure of seasons 1 and 2, and then eventually 3, as a Hail Mary, Paramount decided to put somebody else in charge of season 4, and Manny Coto was that person. For many people, myself not included, we're going to have to see when we get there, but Manny Coto is Enterprise's real daddy. Season 4 is considered by many people to be the best individual season of Star Trek ever made, and I don't really remember why. That's not to say that I thought it was bad or that I thought it was good. It's just that I don't remember enough about the style to be able to evaluate what the differences are. So one of the things that I really wanted to see going into season 3 was whether I could spot the changes that Manny Coto is bringing that inspired Paramount to trust him with the entire Star Trek brand, at least for the last year that Enterprise aired. You see, there are many obvious elements that changed between seasons 2 and 3, but all of them were by network mandate. Manny Coto must have brought something, independent of everything else that I just said, that inspired them to give him the keys. I would like to see if I can spot what that is. Let's start with episode 1, The Xindi. I just want to point out something. This episode makes Dear Doctor look so stupid. Actually, this whole season makes Dear Doctor look so stupid. They do backpedal a little bit and justify it a little bit many episodes later, but if we remember back in season 1, Dear Doctor, the highest rated episode of season 1, generally considered by many to be one of the greatest episodes of Enterprise ever made, argued that genocide was the moral choice because two species cannot evolve into dominance on the same planet. Well, Phlox had never seen two species evolve into dominance on the same planet. The Xindi are a civilization of 5 completely unique intelligent species that evolved on the same planet at roughly the same speed. We've seen the reptilians, the primates, the insectoids. I don't remember what I don't even know what to call them, but like the minor guy, or the guy from the shipment. I don't know what kind of Xindi he is, but we see a bunch of different species, including the dolphins, which is, I'm not making fun of the dolphins. They're a very important part of the Cerritos later on. I mean, I assume that's what that is. I assume those are the same dolphin species that we see in the Cerritos and Lower Decks. But the point is that it is entirely possible for two species to co-evolve on the same planet. Just because it didn't work with Neanderthals doesn't mean it couldn't work for anybody else. But on the topic of the Xindi, they are hinted at to be sympathetic very early and very often. They are angry and they are afraid, but the show tries to make clear to you that this fear is something that has been instilled in them from somebody else. And the anger that they feel and are displaying is because they are afraid for their lives. In fact, this was actually addressed last season. In this episode, it's made very clear that Enterprise is grasping at straws for leads on this. Wherever they go, they're finding it very difficult to find anyone who knows of a Xindi. And in this episode, they come across a mine where supposedly one of the workers is a Xindi primate. They are so desperate for leads that they don't notice that the worker is actually a slave and that the extremely slimy mine owner is actually kidnapping people and forcing them into slavery, which he tries to do to Enterprise and its crew. Malcolm and Archer, and later Trip and Archer, go down to the planet and are able to talk to this guy, and eventually they are able to get the location of what used to be the Xindi homeworld from him. However, the overall tone of the episode seems to be focusing on making you understand that this is the reality now. Trip is angry. Everything's gonna be grimy. People are after Enterprise, which is actually a nice evolution on the concept from season 1, where Enterprise was the underdogs who had to ask people for help. Now that they're a little more competent, they have to take care of themselves in a cruel, cruel world. We meet Major Hayes for real. He seems like a really nice guy, but he and Malcolm get into a little bit of a dispute because he wants to be able to send his people down to the planet, and Malcolm takes this personally. Malcolm is really struggling with the idea that he may have to share authority with someone else, even in this extremely small way in which Hayes actually does take orders from him. Archer and Trip try to extract this Xindi guy, but getting off the planet turned out to be a bit of a problem. Malcolm and Hayes have to mount a big rescue, and they proceed on. I can't believe I didn't notice this last week, so I guess I have to bring it up this time. We see Trip dream about his sister, Elizabeth, who died. And we see this, the big space laser that comes down and destroys their entire hometown. Now, Trip grew up in Panama City, and which is actually a perfect backstory for him based on his voice and based on his career choice. Panama City was the right decision for a place for him to grow up. However, we see very clearly that the laser did not go anywhere near Panama City. It went through the Everglades. It's fine. I understand. No one cares about Florida. No one in Hollywood cares about Florida. It's all right. But this is, of course, added into the other subplot we have this season, which is Star Trek's herky-jerkiest romance subplot with Trip and T'Pol. I will admit that this is one of the subplots that I was most interested in examining going back into Enterprise, because I hated it the first time. Actually, my entire family just felt really confused. When I was in high school, my dad tried to teach me how to drive stick. And I had never driven a car before, basically at all. I had driven around a parking lot like twice. So I struggled with the concept of stick. I just didn't do well. If you've ever seen somebody who can't drive stick try to drive stick, you can imagine, I tried to get going and I would speed up and then I would stall out the engine, maybe go backwards sometimes on accident. Eventually, I almost got my entire family into a car accident So my dad got me a driving instructor instead, and I never learned how to drive a manual transmission car. So yeah, anyway, just picture the speeding up, slamming on the brakes, slowing down, all that kind of stuff. Now picture somebody doing that to a Lamborghini. That's exactly what it's like watching the Trip and T'Pol subplot. The thing is, this is a subplot that we started in season 1, but we had to abandon because at the time it was standard for the main two characters, the male and female lead, to be love interests. So we had to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Archer and T'Pol could not work. Back in the original series, Kirk temporarily had a love interest, Janice Rand, Yeoman Janice Rand. She wasn't really a love interest. She was this person who stood behind the captain and longed for him, and he longed for her, but they couldn't be together because he was the captain and she wasn't. She was basically his personal assistant. But eventually Yeoman Rand was written out of the story, partially because they wanted to be able to give Kirk a different love interest every week if necessary. You know, they didn't want to tie him down to this person he could never actually be with. So we learned that this didn't work back in the 60s, is my point. But we had to test out Archer and T'Pol for a solid season and a half before the network was suitably convinced that it was never, ever going to work. Now, I'm not opposed at all to waiting a couple of seasons to begin a romance arc because you need to develop the characters and set things up. However, it's clear based on the opening to this season that they wanted to be able to start this earlier. Potentially, if they'd been able to start this halfway through season 2, they wouldn't have had to start with this nuke that I would call the first episode. See, I have to apologize. So I remember that when I watched this the first time with my family, we were all very surprised that this was happening. So when I went back and watched it again in the past couple of months, I was interested to see at what point this kind of turned around. Now, in the first half of season 1, it's abundantly clear that Trip and T'Pol are supposed to be interpreted as compatible, at least. In fact, going back and watching season 1 with this subplot in mind, I honestly believe that Trip's character was designed by asking a few specific questions. If we have a Vulcan woman on the ship and we want to give her a love interest, what would a possible love interest for her look like? In season 1, most of the characters are fairly xenophobic, especially towards Vulcans because of the history of the relationship between their people. So this person needs to be someone who gets over the xenophobia all humans seem to have faster than anyone else. Someone who possesses the emotional intelligence to understand what T'Pol is thinking and feeling when she's deliberately trying to hide it. Someone who can communicate with her when she doesn't want to listen to humans because they're stupid. That is exactly what we noticed about Trip in the first episode. That's the value that he brought to the beginning of season 1. This person needs to be someone who respects people for an intrinsic reason. T'Pol is a frustrating jerk, which is really important to the arc of the first season. So everyone else for the first little while straight up doesn't like her and reciprocates her frustration. However, whoever is compatible with T'Pol needs to respect her for their own reasons rather than because she respects them. In Breaking the Ice, we saw that Trip wanted to be completely honest with T'Pol about the borderline espionage they were committing against her. Archer didn't think it was important, but Trip said he needed to be able to look her in the eye when they were both working on the bridge. And it was important to himself that he treated her in a way that allowed him to sleep at night. This gets rationalized as Southern values. You end up with a Southerner. There were a couple of other options they could have gone with here, clearly, but it's a concept that Star Trek hasn't done before or since. I saw a post on Tumblr at one point noting that Vulcan is a desert planet, and Trip always talks about being from swampland, and whether this desert and water thing was supposed to be imagery that you were supposed to pick up on, but I think it's a bit more of a reach. But Trip also has specific qualities that seem to be an answer to qualities that T'Pol herself has beyond being Vulcan. T'Pol is incredibly stubborn, even for a Vulcan, so her counterpart needs to not be a doormat. She's judgmental, so her counterpart needs to be someone who she can respect, someone of extremely similar rank to her, someone who is her intellectual equal. In this episode, in season 3, episode 1, there's a moment where she calls him intransigent, and and then defines the word, and he goes, I know what that means. It's a reminder to the audience that Trip may appear to be a bit of an idiot and a goofball, but he is a genius. He is her intellectual equal, potentially her only intellectual equal on the cast or in the ship. Trip has dated a couple of other characters over the course of the series. He sort of had a thing with the touch-based telepath from Unexpected, his baby mama. There was the sweet engineer's daughter, whom he seemed to have a bit of an interest in, but it didn't really go very far. But the one Trip became most attached to, the one he wanted to see again after he had sex with her in a swamp, was the bitch from Precious Cargo. We saw that her constantly arguing with him kind of got him going, and I'm not going to elaborate on that one any further. There's some other details, like she's the only one who likes his terrible movies and rises to his bait, and she seems to get some Vulcan-acceptable level of joy out of messing with him. So we have a solid foundation when we get to the neuropressure thing. So in a move that is seriously in contention for the most transparent attempt at matchmaking in fiction, Phlox convinces T'Pol to try to teach Trip neuropressure, which is where they sit half naked in T'Pol's floor and touch each other. Borderline, but not actually sexually. This happens for about 2 or 3 minutes per episode, just so that we can kind of check in on how their subplot is going. The thing is, it's like they got complaints about the decon chamber, and they were like, okay, so clearly what people hated about it was the decon chamber. Let's move it to a different room. Anyway, so this is ridiculously horny, and it is just an excuse to get the two most conventionally attractive characters into skimpier clothing, but I have a higher tolerance for this because there are character reasons for it. Phlox could have told T'Pol to teach him to meditate, or given him a book that was boring enough to make him fall asleep whether he wanted to or not, but the neuropressure thing came about because Phlox cares about T'Pol. Phlox wants T'Pol to be happy. T'Pol left her planet and future behind for what she perceives as a suicide mission. She hasn't been around other Vulcans in years, and she's not going to be for a while. She was supposed to get married a couple of years ago, and that has solidly gone nowhere. And at this point, it seems like she probably can't really get along with other Vulcans anymore. Phlox wants what's best for T'Pol, and he has also been around for a couple of the hilarious displays of jealousy that T'Pol has displayed towards Trip in the past. Trip is also very open to new cultures and is the type of person who wants to learn new things. Phlox has been spending a lot of time with Trip in the last couple of months because of the whole thing with Trip's sleep, so he knows Trip pretty well at this point. But most importantly to all of this is that Trip has an opportunity to simply think about something else. In a couple of the previous series and books and all that stuff that we've covered on this channel, we've talked about how it's pretty frequently used as a trope that someone suffers a traumatic event and then gets into a relationship or starts some new chapter of their life. And to some people this may be seen as trite or frustrating, but I think this is incredibly valuable, not specifically the relationship part, but I think it's really important that people who are struggling with this kind of thing are able to simply think about something else. It's been several months since Elizabeth died, and Trip is pulling it to Paul. He's doing his very best to avoid thinking about it. He even says to Malcolm at the end of last season that she was no more or less special than any of the other 7 million people who died, which is bullshit. She was more special to him, and it's clear to the audience that this is affecting everything else about his life. Every waking moment, and even the moments when he's asleep, he is constantly suppressing thinking about the death of his sister. By giving Trip something else to think about, there are times when he doesn't have to suppress that thought. Right now, the topic of his sister's death is like the sun. If he looks at it too hard, it'll hurt him. But track switching allows a person to revisit a topic when they are ready or in a more controlled, healthier way that allows them to push forward with their life and re-examine things in their own time. All of this to say that there's a lot of meat that could be dug into in the relationship between Trip and T'Pol. However, the way it's approached leaves viewers feeling mostly confused. My family was just baffled as to what the hell was going on when we started this subplot, and I blame that on the pacing. The foundation is solid, but the execution is weird. I think it would have been great if they had started this plot line halfway through season 2 and sort of eased us into it. Because they didn't do that, they have to drop this bomb on season 3 episode 1 that just is weirdly, ridiculously horny, and you're not sure whether this is supposed to indicate that anything is going to be different in the series, or if it was just the obligatory nude scene that has to start every season of Enterprise. Then we see the two of them being friendly around each other for a couple of episodes, but then we go back to having T'Pol be Archer's love interest for a little while, and then we go back over to Trip, and it's just odd. I also don't love the fact that half their dialogue sounds like it comes directly out of a porno. A bad one. The second time I watched season 3 episode 1 this week, just as a kind of a recap for myself, I did find it funny instead of horribly cringy, but the first time it was horribly cringy, actually. Anyway, let's move on to episode 2, Anomaly. In this episode, the ship is boarded by a bunch of alien pirates, looted, and then they have to go hunt down what used to be on their ship. This is another nuke, where with Trip and T'Pol, we had to make it really, really, really clear to the audience, who might be idiots, that, by the way, these two might like each other. With Anomaly, we're doing the same thing with Archer's change in morality. Rather than starting to slide us toward the idea that maybe Archer is going to have to do some things he's not satisfied with this season, instead, we open the season on Archer doing cold-blooded torture. Not immediately, like it becomes apparent that's what he's going to have to do over the course of the episode when he does it, and so on. But it's a very heavy-handed way of saying this is the status quo now. It was not just the two-parter finale and premiere of the last season of this one. This is where we're at. Archer is this person now. He has to be this person. Now, I'm not super bothered by this. It was really important that they get this point across, and I do like what they are doing with Archer this season. I don't want Archer to be an asshole. I may have over-exaggerated my hatred towards him in the past. I just want the show to acknowledge that he's doing a fucked up thing if the thing he's doing is fucked up. This allows the show to treat Archer as much more of a real person. He's like a regular guy who has been put in an extraordinarily fucked up situation and is having to figure out how to deal with it in real time in front of the audience, rather than the moral genius we've seen in the past who is always right and everybody else is wrong. Archer is normally a kind person, but this season he's really stressed and being pushed into things by the expectation of humanity, of himself, of his crew, of Trip, who outright told him at the end of last season that it was really important to him that we don't do any of this non-interference shit. And the question that's left to the audience at the end of Anomaly is whether Archer is going to get worse or burn himself out on all this anger. The thing is, the human mind can't sustain certain emotions for a long time. Anger is one of them. You can turn rage into a cold fury, but the rage is going to evolve over time. Archer is clearly not of an angry disposition. This is unnatural for him. But that doesn't mean that he's beyond torture or that he won't get worse. There are a couple of paths available to Archer at this point, and it's up to the audience to think about where he should go and what he should do. They do get something actually useful, which is the database from the Xindi. This is the first time they get an actual win, which came from doing torture. So it's interesting for sure. Then we get Extinction. I actually love this episode, not because it's good, it's not, but I just like it. It's very silly. So what happened with this episode is that it was supposed to be an answer to Threshold. Threshold is an episode of Voyager that is generally considered to be the worst one ever made. I watched it this week, and I could not stop laughing. Like, I laughed the whole time, well, through the last half. It was hilarious, but it was definitely not hilarious on purpose. It's just so absurd. And actually, on Tumblr every year, there's a holiday where we celebrate the anniversary that Threshold came out. Brandon Braga wants to erase this episode from cultural memory, but it's outlasted most of Voyager itself. So this episode was an attempt to take some of those concepts and Try them again in Enterprise. But we're going to take the worst episode of Voyager ever made, and we're going to do it again and see if it's better. And the thing is, like, so Extinction is definitely a better episode than Threshold, but that also makes it less memorable. I really love Threshold, actually, and there's a reason why it is so beloved. And Extinction is almost as ridiculous, but not quite. So the idea behind Threshold is that a couple of the members of the crew are evolving into this other species. I'm trying to keep it vague because please watch it. And the rest of the crew has to deal with the fact that these two particular crew members are changing into a different species. In Extinction, the general flow of the episode is that T'Pol, Archer, Malcolm, and Hoshi go down to a planet, and it turns out there's a virus on this planet that was left there by the species that went extinct. They stopped being able to reproduce, so they created a virus that would turn other humanoids into this species, the Lokek. And when they go down there, the 3 human members of the away team turn into Lokek, and T'Pol is immune to this virus. The ship gets attacked by some intergalactic busybodies who decide that they need to execute everybody who is exposed to the virus so that it cannot spread. The acting is ridiculous. Hoshi, Malcolm, and Archer are just acting like... they're acting very silly. I appreciate that there is a species of humanoids in Star Trek other than the Vulcans and the Klingons who habitually behave differently than humans. They have different body language and they move differently, but it's just so silly. The situation is resolved because Trip had given T'Pol a bunch of peaches and she had eaten part of one and left it, which Phlox is able to use to synthesize a cure for this disease from T'Pol's spit that was left on the peach. And then, the intergalactic busybodies don't have to go kill a bunch of people every time somebody gets this virus. I've watched this episode a couple of times because I watched it once by myself and then once with friends. And I don't hate it. Despite how very, very silly it is and a little bit stupid, it's not infuriating. There are a couple of other episodes that are infuriating or outright boring, and this is not one of them. The fact that it's so whatever it is made it more than tolerable both times I saw it. Is this going to be anybody's favorite episode? No. Is this one of the greats? Absolutely not. Would I skip it? I don't know. However, I wouldn't dismiss this episode on first watch, because it does actually serve a couple of purposes, even if slight, and they both have to do with T'Pol. For one of the things this episode is trying to achieve is it's trying to establish like a positive connotation about the Trip and T'Pol relationship for the audience. Part of the point of this episode is showing that there's a problem that became significantly easier to solve because somebody was hanging out with T'Pol. Somebody was able to get a sample of her saliva out of her room because he knew it was there. This is a problem that would have been much bigger if Trip and T'Pol hadn't been hanging out. It's important at this phase of this subplot that the audience doesn't see the relationship between Trip and T'Pol as being subtractive. But this episode also serves as a last-minute counterpoint to Impulse, where it becomes clear that if the ship is going to proceed through the Delphic Expanse, they are going to pretty much have to choose between their own safety and T'Pol's safety. There have never really been any other Vulcans in the Delphic Expanse, which is why they were never able to cure this disease. But in order to keep the ship safe, they have to line it with Trellium-D, which is poisonous to Vulcans. So we're throwing in some last-minute arguments as to why it is a good thing that T'Pol is kept on the ship, even when it's clear there are some serious drawbacks. Then there's Rajin. I love this episode because it shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that Archer was being a massive hypocrite in Cogenitor. What happens in this episode is a sex slave runs away from her master and attaches herself to Archer. Archer rescues her and gives her asylum, and then she turns out to be a spy. I wish I had more to say about this episode, but it is a bunch of stuff we've already seen kind of mushed around. We get a little bit more of the, trying to build a positive connotation about the Trip and T'Pol relationship. Regine sneaks into T'Pol's room, knocks her out, and then Trip finds her, which allows them to figure out that Regine is a spy. Archer rescues this woman, which makes him look good, but also it's weird. It's a weird episode. It does make it clear that the Xindi are trying to develop a biological weapon, one that will work against humans on a biological level, but she scans the biological data of the humans and T'Pol, but not Phlox, even though she knows that Phlox is Denobulan. So I'm not really clear what they were trying to achieve. At the end, Regine makes it back to the Xindi Council, where she delivers them a bunch of information about human physiology, and presumably Vulcan physiology, I guess. But yeah, it makes Kogenitor look really stupid. Next we have Impulse. This one's very well known as the Vulcan zombie episode. I see this one discussed probably at least once a week on the Star Trek subreddit. People will ask a question like, have we ever seen the inside of a Vulcan ship? And they say, what do you mean you haven't seen Impulse, Season 3, Episode 5 of Enterprise, which is the Vulcan zombie episode? That being said, I think all of that made me a little bit too excited for this episode. There's nothing wrong with it, really. It's a solid, interesting episode that I think I got a little bit overhyped for by all of the discussion. We do get a little bit of elaboration on Vulcan physiology. It's been hinted at before, but they really clarify it here. We know that Vulcans used to be this extremely violent species, and they evolved this additional physical component to their nervous system that suppresses their emotions, serves as a layer between their mind and their feelings. And Trellium-D degrades this barrier. Degrades the part of their physiology that allows them to not be emotional. However, while it does do brain damage that will eventually kill a Vulcan on the way there, we get to see what a Vulcan is like on the inside. In this episode, Enterprise comes across a Vulcan ship that went missing a long time ago. Turns out it's actually T'Pol's previous posting, the Saleya. I remember this because I actually wonder if the Salayans from the Orville are named after this ship, since I believe this is the season where Seth MacFarlane will appear. Anyway, Malcolm, Archer, T'Pol, and a couple of the Makos go and try to help, but it becomes clear that the Vulcans are beyond reasoning. Over the course of the episode, T'Pol also begins to fall ill. We see the stages of this neural degradation as she goes through them. First, she becomes a bit nervous, concerned for herself, but then she becomes suspicious, accusatory. She starts throwing things at people, threatening to kill people. She thinks that Archer has been lying to her the whole time. Again, Vulcans are the most suspicious people, and we pretty much see why here. They are suspicious by nature. They have to suppress being suspicious all the time. Paranoid. Eventually, T'Pol becomes such a rage monster that Archer has to knock her out and carry her the rest of the way out of the ship so that they can get back to Enterprise, and Phlox treats her for the degradation that she suffered. The rest of the ship is beyond saving, which causes the majority of T'Pol's paranoia, probably. She did appear to have some amount of attachment to her previous ship, and accepting the fact that they were not going to be able to save them was very difficult. But it becomes clear over the course of this episode that Trellium-D, which is a substance that insulates ships from the anomalies in the area, is poisonous to Vulcans. Now, we find out in the following episode that these anomalies are being caused by a bunch of the weird spheres we saw in episode 2, and if they can eliminate them, they should not have to deal with the anomalies anymore, or they should at least be able to avoid them. However, Archer is presented with an important choice here. He can find a planet to leave T'Pol on, and then come back and pick her up later, which is what she asked for, or bring her along, but not insulate the ship against these life-threatening anomalies. He decides to keep T'Pol because he says he doesn't want to leave anyone behind. And so far, a huge number of the episodes that we've seen in this season have been about what Archer is willing to leave behind for the sake of this mission. In episode 2, we saw that he was willing to leave behind a significant amount of his morality. In this episode, he decides he's not willing to leave behind T'Pol. In Exile, he suffers a very similar choice with Hoshi, He could give up Hoshi in exchange for plenty of information about the Xindi, but he decides not to, although it's not really his decision. In The Shipment, he has another different moral conundrum on how to treat someone he is questioning. And then in Similitude, the conflict of the episode is what Archer is willing to do to save Trip, who is necessary for the continued running of the Warp Core. The point being that this has to end dramatically. Archer will have to give up something. The question is just what. At this point, it looks like it probably won't be Trip, T'Pol, or Hoshi, since we've already covered that ground, but you can't keep everything. You can't win every single battle. And that's been made pretty clear by the tone of this season so far. The Expanse keeps offering shortcuts Archer can take in order to make progress easier, but he doesn't seem to ever be willing to take shortcuts. And in many ways that's admirable, but at some point he will probably have to make up for all that lost time. I also think based on this that, like we said, T'Pol is the first Vulcan to really spend any time in the Delphic Expanse. Presumably what happened to the Slayas would happen to all of the other Vulcan ships, which is why they haven't really made it in there, but T'Pol has the opportunity to make it farther because Enterprise is not insulated with Trellium-D. So I have to come to the conclusion that by the end of this season, T'Pol will have some major contribution to the Delphic Expanse because she is a Vulcan who has gone where no Vulcan has gone before. And I'm happy to report that I have no memory of where this is going, so I really hope I don't remember where this is going, and continue to be surprised. But I'm excited to see where it goes. Next we get Exile. Exile, I feel like, is one of those episodes that could have been really cool and good, but it just didn't have very much effort put into it, and so it's lacking. This is a recurring theme in... Well, I wish I could say this is a recurring theme in Hoshi episodes, but we haven't gotten one of those in a while, so it's difficult to detect patterns when you don't have very many data points. Hoshi is telepathically contacted by a hot guy who tells her that if she comes to his planet, he's willing to exchange time with her for information about the Xindi. However, when she gets to the planet, it turns out that this is a Beauty and the Beast story. So Tarquin tries to make a deal with Hoshi that if she stays on his planet and marries him, he will give Enterprise as much information as they could possibly need, thus potentially actually saving humanity. However, Hoshi doesn't want to do this because this guy's a creep. It's supposed to be a Beauty and the Beast story, but I do think it's lacking in a couple of important aspects. Hoshi is never really tempted. In the original legend, Bel is won over by the Beast's heart, but Tarquin doesn't really have one. I mean, he does have one, but it's not one that Hoshi is compatible with. He tries to convince her that they are similar, and there are definitely ways that they are similar. However, he infiltrates her mind and implants lies into them. He makes her hallucinate that Archer is telling her she's going to stay on the planet and that he doesn't want her to come back. He's generally controlling and also much older than her. Not that that's necessarily a problem when you're dealing with different species, but in this case, he's had several wives who lived their whole lives and then died on his planet. It's been like hundreds of years since he last had one. So they're not equals. It would be very, very difficult for her to learn to love him, especially when he has been so cruel to her. Cruel is the wrong word. They really started off on the wrong foot, and there isn't much indication that they can get onto a right foot. Because of this, the episode largely comes down to Hoshi hanging out with a guy who really sucks, and eventually her winning him over, which I did like. She threatens to break his crystal ball of seeing or whatever, and that eventually convinces him to give up the information. However, this could have either been a smaller plot or it could have been more beefed out. I think it should have been more beefed out. I think this could have been really cool. At the very least, it could have been stylish. We're going to get to Twilight soon, which is a single episode love story that is beloved because of how dramatic it is. And I think they could have achieved that with Exile if they had tried to do that, but they didn't. It's not a horrible episode, but it's not really a good one. Then we have The Shipment. I was really excited about this episode because based on the opening, I thought it was going to be about Malcolm. I can't wait for Malcolm to come back. I really hope this isn't an indicator that we're going to be seeing less of Malcolm from here on out. Malcolm is one of my favorite characters, and there's so much to him that resonates so strongly with the themes of this season. He's a guy from a military family in the military season, and we don't have any episodes about Malcolm. That being said, this episode is about Archer, and it is actually very good. Unfortunately. Enterprise is able to find the facility where the metal that is being used to create the weapon that will be used against Earth is being refined. They break into the home of the lead metallurgist and question him. However, fortunately, the metallurgist is a very wise person. He's a Xindi who understands history and remembers what happened to his home planet and realizes that it's a bad thing that his people are going after Earth. So even though Archer breaks into his house, he is open to the idea of helping him to stop this weapon. He tells the story of the avian Xindi, a species that is no longer in existence. I do wish we understood why none of them are in space. If any of them are going to be in space, I guess it would be... I guess I can see why it would be unappealing for avians to go to space. But I'm very curious about them now, and I hope we do learn a little bit more about the avian Xindi. I don't really like how this episode makes Malcolm kind of look bad in order to make Archer look better. Every time they have to shoot guns, Archer is able to hit every target on the first try, and Malcolm can't shoot for shit, despite that being his actual fucking job. Malcolm talks Archer into going to war in literally one sentence, which is effective for showing us just how close to the edge Archer is, but then Archer talks himself back off of it without any input from Malcolm or any character material, really. I appreciate the fact that they have pretty much given up on time sanitation and just investigate stuff from the future whenever. There's a subplot where Phlox, Trip, and T'Pol are investigating this gun from the future that is alive and intelligent enough to aim and shoot. However, there's not a whole lot to it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just kind of flavoring. It's one of those plots that they didn't want it to be too distracting from the A-plot of the episode, which is fine. The A-plot being very, very similar to Judgment in how poignant it is and how it's about Archer connecting with somebody from an enemy species. I do appreciate the fact that the contrast with Malcolm and Hayes shows that it's a good thing Starfleet at least pretends to not be the military. There's a lot of debate online about whether Starfleet is military. I personally think that Starfleet is very militaristic, but they at least claim to not be military, potentially for branding. But the fact that Starfleet identifies as not being military is so important here. Archer has to rule out the peaceful option before he goes to war, and that's important. But this is potentially the most important episode of this set for this season's overall arc about the Xindi. This wise metallurgist helps Archer understand that the Xindi are afraid, and that the Xindi are people who can be reasoned with. And even if they can't be reasoned with, they can at least be understood. The Xindi are desperate because they've already lost their planet. Speaking of further annihilation of a people after the loss of a planet, let's talk about Twilight. Twilight was one of the episodes that I was most looking forward to of this season. And that's because when I was 10 years old, I really hated this episode. I don't remember why. I do remember that when Twilight became popular, I thought people were talking about this episode of Enterprise. But I remember that I didn't like this episode when it first came out. However, in the years since, on all of the lists of top 10 episodes of Enterprise you have to watch, Twilight is at or near the top. This is a very beloved episode, and I was really interested to get to it and see, what was it that I missed the first time? Is my opinion going to change? And the answer is no, I fucking hate this episode. Now, I will say I absolutely understand why this episode is beloved. This is the episode that tries to impart the stakes of the season on the audience, and it does so through spectacle. See, it's going to turn out over the course of the next 2 seasons that what was missing from Enterprise was spectacle. What was missing from Star Trek was spectacle, because nothing they did with Enterprise saved Star Trek until J.J. Abrams brought spectacle in 2009 to the movies. The 2009 movies is what caused the resurgence that led to all of the great Star Trek we're getting today. People wanted planets to blow up, frankly. And this is one of the only episodes that gives us that, and it gives us that with low stakes. It's pretty obvious from the first couple of minutes of the episode that what is happening now is not going to stick. So whatever happens is purely informative and purely entertaining. However, this episode is three things. For one, it is an apocalypse story, which it does pretty well. I have some problems with it, like it says that they move all of the humans to be on one planet, which is just idiotic. It's an Alzheimer's story, and it's a love story. This is the most romantic Star Trek episode I've ever seen. And I don't think it does the Alzheimer's story or the love story well. So from here on out, I'm pretty much going to be talking about the things I didn't like about this episode. It actually took me 2 hours to get through this episode because I kept pausing to find literally anything else to do. This episode made me kind of uncomfortable, and I'll start with the low-hanging fruit of why it did. You could probably already guess this, but there's this joke that I cut from the episode 2 weeks ago in which I was talking about the first half of season 2. I wanted to put in this one particular joke, but I thought it was a bit too much, so I cut it, but now I wish I had left it. The joke was that in the 7th, an episode that I did not like, T'Pol was replaced by her identical twin sister, T'Pau. T'Pau is what I call the weird alternate characterization of T'Pol that we get whenever there's an episode about Archer and T'Pol after season 1. See, in season 1, the character development between Archer and T'Pol was very good. But at the end of season 1, they figure out how to run a spaceship together. They did it. And now, even though both of them have their own individual well-written arcs that are ongoing and they've got a whole lot going on, the writers don't really know what to do about putting them together. The only thing they know is that it's really important that T'Pol doesn't look better than Archer, because that's bad. I don't like T'Pau because she doesn't have a brain. Now, there are other reasons that I don't like this episode, but I do want to cover T'Pau first. The thing is, if somebody is sitting down to watch just one episode of Enterprise with you at this point in the story, and they ask you who each of the characters are, what would you say about them? Think for a moment, like, how would you describe each member of the cast? As far as T'Pol goes, if I had to describe T'Pol to someone who is sitting down to watch just one episode of Enterprise around this time in the story, what would I say? I said, okay, generally if I had to describe T'Pol to a person who is sitting down with me to watch an episode, I'd say she's a scientist who is also the first officer of the ship. She's pretty closed off emotionally, so she struggles with leadership, but she's a reliable decision maker in Archer's absence and can handle problem solving for most situations. She's a Vulcan, but she's become kind of tainted by living with humans for so many years and feels guilty about not being Vulcan enough, but also curious about what it would be like to let go of certain things. She's friends with Phlox and sometimes Hoshi, and there's something going on between her and the engineer. T'Pau has literally none of these things. T'Pau has literally the opposite of every single one of these character traits. She's always given a different job, most importantly. She's never allowed to be a scientist or the first officer. In the 7th, she was a cop. In this episode, she's the captain. But in every one of these, she sucks. They give her a job that is better or more badass or cooler or whatever, but she has to suck at it. She's emotionally very open, honest, and straightforward. Her emotions typically don't conflict because she's only ever feeling one thing at a time, and she knows what it is that she's feeling. The reason she always has to suck at her weird, temporary other job has to be like a random reason that doesn't really have to do with anything. And her Vulcan roots don't matter except in the most literal sense. She has no friends, she specifically always doesn't get along with Trip, and she's completely, mindlessly, absolutely devoted to Archer. In this episode, what happens is that Archer is hit with an anomaly that causes him to have some, like, subspace infection, something that prevents him from being able to create new memories. T'Pol is put in charge of the ship, she becomes captain of the ship, and within a couple of weeks, Earth is annihilated, all of the humans die, except for 6,000 of them who move to a reserve planet. The rest of the ships guard this planet, and T'Pol turns in her uniform in order to become Archer's nurse. Archer wakes up 12 years later, and T'Pol tells all of them this, which is what she has told him every morning for the past 12 years. It turns out that Phlox has eventually developed a cure for this. They go back to Enterprise. We see what everybody is like 12 years later. Spoiler, they're exactly the same. The cure doesn't exactly work for reasons that have to do with Trip being an idiot now that he's captain of the ship. Archer ends up having to blow the ship up, creating an explosion that ripples backwards in time, preventing him from ever being infected in the first place. So like I said, this is an apocalypse story, an Alzheimer's story, and a love story. As an apocalypse story, it is definitely the best one that we've seen from Enterprise. I'm not sure if there's another one coming later, and I'm not sure if there's another one from previous Star Trek series that this could be compared to. So it feels very special and very big. But I don't like it as an Alzheimer's story. Caretaking is a fundamental part of the human experience. The Old Testament or the Torah talks about the virtue of caring for an ill or deceased loved one. It's emotionally difficult. It's something that most people, or at least a huge percent of the population, is going to have to deal with. At some point, it's very likely that you in the audience are going to have to deal with taking care of an ill parent or spouse or even child for years. You're going to have to watch this person wither away and suffer. And this episode really romanticizes that. This episode says that watching Archer suffer is T'Pol's calling, but Archer doesn't suffer either. He has the prettiest case of Alzheimer's I've ever seen. I think this episode could have made sense if T'Pol's devotion to Archer was out of guilt. She indirectly caused the death of at least 7 billion people. Humanity is probably going to die out, and it's her fault, but it doesn't bother her at all. There's one and only one reason that she has for doing any of this, and that's because she loves Archer completely, in the romantic sense. She doesn't have multiple thoughts in her mind. I will admit that I have negative patience for Archer and T'Pol as a romantic pairing. That's not out of any kind of loyalty to Trip and T'Pol as a romantic pairing. That's not it. It's that Archer has to be the specialist, most important boy when he's around anyone else, especially members of his crew. And whenever there's an episode about the relationship between Archer and someone else, if it isn't handled well, we end up with this. 2 episodes from now, in Similitude, for one, T'Pol will have a completely different love interest, whom she has about a third as much screen time with, and it's so much better. But at the end of the story, Sim decides to sacrifice himself in his sister's memory. It's a very poignant scene. However, we do not think when he does this that it means he loves T'Pol any less. His love for his sister does not take away from the other things he has going on. And that's real. What makes this episode so romantic is the absolute lack of concern that T'Pol has for anything and anyone else. So in this episode, T'Pol torches her relationships with everyone else, gives up her future, and ever even thinking about herself again for Archer's sake. And this isn't a gendered problem, right? Like this, I mean, people have noted that there is potentially a gendered way you can see this episode, and I don't really disagree with that because, you know, the characterization of T'Pol as a nurse and all that kind of stuff. But this is a problem we've seen with Trip. We've called this out as a problem that Trip has all the time. And it's become less of a problem recently, but in season 1, Trip was really prone to just suddenly becoming so much more concerned with Archer's emotional well-being than he was for his own life. So T'Pau dooms humanity by ramming Enterprise into a Xindi ship, except it turns out that that's like not actually the problem or something, but she rams Enterprise into a Xindi ship, thus disabling their warp engines, and then they're not really able to go anywhere very fast, and then the Xindi destroy Earth. There are a lot of problems with T'Pol's leadership. There are genuine issues in T'Pol's character development that she needs to get over in order to be a better leader. We've seen that she avoids problems. If there's a problem that she's uncomfortable dealing with, she will just pretend like it doesn't exist. She avoids learning anything about humans. She's judgmental. She doesn't get along with other people. She's a bit of a bitch. But none of these things, which are part of her actual character development, part of the stuff she's supposed to get over, none of these things have anything to do with what she does to doom humanity. If you're going to argue that Archer has to be the savior of humanity because if he's taken out of the picture, T'Pol will fuck it up so badly all the humans will die, at least make it about something T'Pol would actually do. It's almost like they wrote this episode for somebody else. Previously on Octopus Literary's coverage of Star Trek Enterprise. I have to compare this to Janeway. Janeway was the captain of Voyager. Chakotay is her first officer throughout the series, and they work as a team. Janeway backs him up every time. She says, I have his back, and you will have his back. I would also like to say that they did just sit through 7 seasons of Janeway and Chakotay having about 15 times more sexual chemistry than Archer and T'Pol. So, these two definitely seem lackluster in comparison. So what happened with this episode is that it was supposed to be an answer to Threshold. Brandon Braga wants to erase this episode from cultural memory, but it's outlasted most of Voyager itself. But we're going to take the worst episode of Voyager ever made, and we're going to do it again and see if it's better.
Please watch it.
So I found out that this episode was originally written for Voyager. This was actually an unused Voyager script that was supposed to be about Janeway and Chakotay. Janeway and Chakotay are 2 completely different characters than Archer and T'Pol. For one, whenever Chakotay isn't doing anything, Robert Beltran, who plays him, decided it would probably be best if he was staring longingly at Janeway while she isn't looking. Sometimes while she is looking. This led to the possibility that he could be in love with her at some point, or at least believably be in love with her in a different timeline. Janeway and Chakotay are also much older, not much older, but more mature than Archer and T'Pol are. And Chakotay is the kind of person who I believe could be a caretaker and deal with that kind of responsibility for a long time. But I also think that given the circumstances that Voyager is on, the implication would be that he was still in charge of something, still doing something with his life, while he was taking care of Janeway. In this episode, due to the nature of the conflict that we're in, it becomes necessary for T'Pol to give up everything and everyone in order to take care of Archer. I'm not opposed to people taking care of each other or plots where people give up things in order to take care of other people. But the portrayal here is so romantic it makes me uncomfortable. Particularly because T'Pol never has any complicated feelings on the topic. She never feels guilt. She never wishes she could talk to someone who isn't an amnesiac. She never regrets anything or regrets the life she could have had. She's simply 100% blindly devoted to Archer. And that is portrayed as romance. Personally, I don't find that romantic. For one, I think reciprocation is damn romantic. But for 2, it simply doesn't feel like T'Pol. You had to give up all of her actual character traits and replace her with someone who is effectively somebody else. And then as far as Archer goes, Archer has been an amnesiac for the past 12 years, cared for by other people, and everybody else dies before him so that he can save the day. I don't like this episode. I see why people like it, but I don't. I think if you took out the 5-second shot where the Earth gets blown up, which is a beautiful shot, props to the VFX people that were working on that. I think if you took that shot out, this episode would not be particularly memorable. Next, we've got North Star. I didn't take a whole lot of notes for this one. There's not a whole lot to it that we haven't seen before. It's just kind of mushed around, which is okay with me. I like a fun episode as much as anybody else. Actually, I think I like fun episodes more than everybody else. But this episode, just to toss this out here, this is another episode that shows that Archer was purely being a dick and cogenitor. The concept for this episode is actually really interesting. A bunch of humans were abducted by aliens from the Wild West, brought to this other planet where they were supposed to be slaves for a colony, and a colony run by aliens called the Skagarans. And then the humans overthrew the aliens, and now the aliens are treated as second-class citizens. It's basically a Wild West planet. The Enterprise crew goes there and kind of gets the lay of the land. Archer befriends a local teacher who is illegally teaching the Skagaran children how to read. It just reminded me of Cogenitor. It reminded me of the part where Trip teaches the Cogenitor how to read, and then Archer loses his shit. There may come a point when I stop thinking about that, but that just happened last week. So the Enterprise crew comes to the decision that they are going to reveal themselves to these humans, tell them that humans have really made a lot of progress in that time and that they will come back for them later. I think this is really interesting. I wish this was followed up on. As far as I understand, it isn't. And the episode doesn't really imply that they will follow up on it, but I genuinely think it would have been interesting to have like a 2 or 3-parter where we deal with how to bring these people up to speed. What are we going to do with this colony? Even discounting the Skagarans, like, this is a group of people who, unlike the people in Terra Nova, these people retained their human identity. and their human culture 300 years in the past. So now we're finally at Similitude, the last episode we're going to be covering today. There are a bunch of notable things about Similitude. For one, this is the first episode written by Manny Coto. Manny Coto being the person who will take over the series in season 4. I was worried, but after this episode, I'm very excited to get to season 4. Just this one episode proved to me that Manny Coto understands Enterprise, understands what I want out of Enterprise and its characters and its themes and its stories. I've seen some complaints that this episode is too much of a standard Star Trek episode, but damn, this might be the best Star Trek episode I've ever seen. This episode has like an A, B, C, D, E, and F plot, some of which are much more blatant than others, and every single one of them is knocked out of the park. What happens in this episode is that Trip trips and falls, really, and gives himself brain damage falling off of a high place in engineering, and gets put into a coma. Archer is given 2 options, really. Let Trip die, or create a clone of Trip for the purposes of organ harvesting that will allow Phlox to put Trip's brain back together. This clone would live for 15 days, be born as a baby, grow old, and then die 15 days later, unless he dies sooner. And Archer has to choose what to do with that. This episode is about a lot of things. First and foremost, this episode is about the evolving moral situation that Archer is put in. First, it's a question of whether to create this life that is intended to save Trips, but at first it doesn't seem like it's that bad of an idea. I don't think, and this is of course my own interpretation of the episode, but I don't think it is intrinsically bad to create the clone in the first place. A life that is short is still a life. But what happens in the episode is that Phlox figures out they are not going to be able to allow Sim to live out his full lifespan. Sim is the clone of Trip. It was thought they would be able to harvest some tissue from Sim at around the halfway mark, and then allow him to live out the rest of his life uninterrupted. But it turns out that Sim is a bit more fragile than Trip is, and he wouldn't be able to survive the procedure in which part of his brain is removed. So basically what this comes down to is murder. Humanity needs Enterprise, and Enterprise needs Trip. Any amount of sacrifice is worth it to protect the warp core. So Archer has a bunch of choices. For one, he can allow both Trip and Sim to die, and allow someone else to become the chief engineer. This isn't really on the table. It's there. For 2, he can murder Sim. He can do whatever it takes to tie him down and extract the parts of his brain that he needs. For 3, and this is what he goes with, he can talk Sim into wanting to die. This is what he tries to do, but what he really achieves is losing all respect in Sim's eyes, pretty much, until Sim talks himself into being willing to give up his life for Trip. But the other thing that this episode is about, and this encompasses the other several plots, is examining Trip's role in the story. How important is Trip? Do we really need to keep him alive, or can we promote somebody else who will be able to perform his job to 95, 97%? How do the other people on the ship feel about Trip? And how do the other people on the ship feel about Sim? The 3 other characters other than Sim in this episode that really show up are Archer, Phlox, and T'Pol. But the primary character in this episode is Sim. And Sim is very different from Trip. He is grounded by Trip's goodness. Trip is, of course, this intensely loving and compassionate and emotional person who has always tried to be the best person he can possibly be. And that is a solid foundation for Sim's personality to be built on. But this situation would turn anyone into a psychopath, and Sim veers dangerously close. In like the second conversation that Archer and Trip ever have in the very first episode of the entire series, Trip begs Archer to be able to go on an away mission, and Archer says no. He says, we can't allow Enterprise to be without its chief engineer. And throughout the series, this is the most consistent friction that Archer and Trip have. Trip wants to go out into space to see things. He is here to experience the universe. But Archer thinks that Trip is so important, he is unwilling to risk him going outside. So spoilers for a movie that came out 15 years ago and that everybody has already seen, but in the second and third Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Will is being sucked into the role of Davy Jones, the captain of the Flying Dutchman. Whoever is the captain of the Flying Dutchman is the immortal heart and captain of the ship, but he can't ever leave except for once every 10 years. He always has to be on the water. He always has to be attached to the ship. And there's this chant that people are chanting whenever Will is around. Part of the ship, part of the crew, part of the ship, part of the crew. I haven't thought about that movie in years. I was required to do an essay on it in high school, and I haven't seen it since. But I was watching this episode, Similitude, and I heard that chant in the back of my mind. Trip is the heart of the ship, but he cannot leave. Why would you leave? There is food here. The warp core is here. You can go find a beautiful alien jerk among the stars, but we have one of those right here in engineering. Sim feels very deeply for T'Pol under these circumstances. There is a version of Trip who would love her if he was dying and never allowed to leave the ship or meet anyone, and she was the only woman he knew, and his best friend and trusted captain told him that he was going to kill him. At the beginning of the episode, Phlox is excited about the prospect of having a baby, really. He understands that what's coming is difficult, but he enjoys fatherhood while he has it. Phlox is an extremely emotionally resilient person, which is why every time Phlox cries in this episode, I cried too. He loves Sim as a son, and you can tell from his behavior throughout the series that he misses being a parent. But he is the one who has to tell Archer that they are going to have to kill Sim before he dies of old age. And so Phlox is fucking miserable. And at first, Archer blames Phlox for this mishap. Archer doesn't want to deal with the fact that he is going to have to sentence Sim to die. And so at first, he takes it out on Phlox. But Phlox is able to force Archer to understand that this is a burden they are going to have to share. I want to call out the kid who plays the middle Sim. He's also the kid who played Trip in Trip's Dream in the first episode of this season. He's the one who flies the model plane around the cargo bay. That kid is amazing. He mimics Trip's mannerisms so well. I almost wish there's another time we can have an excuse to see this kid, because he bounces on his heels the way Trip does. He kind of cocks his head in the same way. I was so impressed with this kid, especially because at this time, child actors were not nearly as good as they are now. But after this, the rest of the episode is about Sim's relationships with Archer and T'Pol. Archer at first tries to talk Sim into wanting to die, and it simply isn't working. So we get a couple of the best scenes in the series, although I honestly feel like almost any scene in this episode is in the running for best scene in the series. But what comes first in my mind is this scene where Sim is sitting in Trip's room and Archer comes and tells him he cannot be there. Sim tries to talk Archer into allowing him to live, and Archer explains to him that he doesn't want to have to kill him, but he will. We've never seen Trip yell at Archer. We've seen Archer yell at Trip, and it hurt. But this hurts worse. What makes this episode so powerful as a moral question is just how clear it is that Archer is doing something that is fucked up. Like I said, I am okay with Archer doing fucked up things. I just want the show to be willing to acknowledge that they are screwed up when he does them. And in this episode, Archer is characterized so well. Do I want Archer to be this level of dick all the time? No. Archer is a nice person who is dealing with this horrible, horrible situation the best he possibly can, and that is by being a Vulcan. He never once mentions the fact that Trip is his best friend in the whole wide world. Enterprise needs Trip because Enterprise needs its warp core, and that's the only thing he allows himself to think about. So because of all of this, Sim is seeking significance. He wants to be important to something or someone who isn't Trip. He asks Archer if he can pilot one of the shuttle pods in something they're doing that's important to the story or whatever. But Archer says no. He says that he is unwilling to risk Sim's health, which by proxy risks Trip's health, and instead risks the lives of Travis and Malcolm, which is fucked up in its own way, but deliciously so. I really appreciated this one moment where the middle Sim says that being the captain of a starship must be immense fun, and Archer just has this expression of hidden pain, and he says it has its moments, as in, overall, at this point, he's fucking miserable. He's standing in front of this kid, the clone of his best friend, whom he's going to have to kill. So Sim is really trying to find significance. He can't be significant to the mission. He's not significant to his best friend, who is trying to kill him, or trying to talk him into being willing to die. He's not significant to his family, who have no idea that he exists. He's significant to Trip, but that comes with all of its own baggage. He's not even the chief engineer, because Trip is, and T'Pol is temporarily serving in his role. So Trip is seeking some way to be significant to something, anything, or in this case, someone. So he latches onto T'Pol. Not that Trip isn't attached to T'Pol. I don't mean to minimize whatever is going on between Trip and T'Pol. Whatever. Sim is much more attached to T'Pol because she's the only thing he has. At the beginning of the episode, T'Pol tells Archer that he should just let Trip die, rather than commit this act of barbarity. It establishes right at the beginning that T'Pol is one of the only people who has sympathy for Sim specifically as separate from Trip, Phlox being the other one. At one point around the midpoint of the episode, he delivers this confession of feelings to T'Pol that is so earnest, it can only come from a dying man who has nothing. And I've always seen T'Pol as staying on the ship because she is appreciated. On Vulcan, she's a cog in the machine, but on Enterprise, she's special. She skips a rank based on where she would be on Vulcan because she is Vulcan. She's the only Vulcan on the ship. She's deeply beloved by everyone. You know, in this season, even to the point where everyone else is risking their lives to keep her on board. T'Pol enjoys being appreciated. And Trip, while Trip probably has feelings for her, whatever, Sim is the one who expresses it. He says, "You are all I think about." So I'm not sure if T'Pol has genuine feelings for Trip at this point, at least that she's aware of. I'm not even sure if Trip has genuine feelings for T'Pol that he's aware of. But this sentiment that comes from Sim towards T'Pol is incredibly meaningful to her because of who she is as a person. So in an act of borderline uncharacteristic boldness, she goes to Trip's room before Sim is about to go into surgery and kisses him before he gives up his life. Sim and T'Pol each do something a bit fucked up and unheroic in this episode regarding each other. Sim taking what would be Trip's confession of love in an effort to be somehow significant in T'Pol's life, and T'Pol going to his room and kissing him before he dies. Selfish and morally questionable, but not outright morally objectionable in either sense. He wants her to remember him and to have something that Trip wanted but didn't. And she wanted the admiration and knowledge she was loved without the complication of having to confront Trip or navigate an actual romantic relationship. It's easy to love someone for a moment, 15 minutes before he dies. A shinier, more perfect version of T'Pol might have waited for Trip to wake up, told him how grateful she was that he was alive, and kissed him then, but that's not the T'Pol we've got. In this way, Sim might actually be a better match for her. I don't even know if she'll tell Trip this ever happened. I say borderline uncharacteristic, but I do not mean to imply that this is out of character. This is where her character is going. She has been the mind, but she is becoming the heart of the story. She liked the fact that Sim liked her, and he told her outright that there was no guarantee those feelings came from Trip at all. Notice how much more effective a love story this is than Twilight, and it barely takes up, I don't know, probably 8 minutes of screen time in the episode. T'Pol feels uncomfortable with the situation with Sim. She avoids him and then is eventually won over when he confronts her directly about the way she behaves around him. Sim is sort of using her as a way to feel good about his short life, but that doesn't mean that he's being dishonest or manipulative. He's just doing what he feels is right. Like I said, I have negative patience for Archer and T'Pol specifically as a romantic pairing because of the sheer imbalance in importance between the two of their characters. It's some number for T'Pol and infinity for Archer. But with Trip and T'Pol, we get this 60-40 split that could go towards either of them at any given time. in this episode, it's borderline 50-50 because the episode is about Sim, but only T'Pol remembers that this happened. Ultimately, Sim decides to give himself up in memory of his sister. And like I said, this does not detract from the rest of his character. This adds to it. He goes to sickbay and he thanks Phlox for being his dad, which I've seen this episode 3 times now, and I cried every single time he said that. Anyway, but he goes to Trip and says, "You owe me one," before lying down on the operating table. And for one, that moment is brilliant because you do actually wonder if Sim is going to rip out the breathing tube and kill Trip, thus forcing everyone to keep Sim for the rest of the series, which would have been interesting, but I'm glad that didn't happen. But for 2, he says, "You owe me one." And what does that mean? For one, it definitely it's supposed to be stylistic in the moment. Like Sim wants to say something to Trip because of their connection, because he lived for him and died for him. But I think thematically, narratively, we're alluding to the fact that Trip has to get off this ship. It's going to eat him. Trip is Will in the 2nd and 3rd Pirates of the Caribbean movie. I mean, Sim definitely was. Sim got eaten by the ship. Sim became the heart of the ship all over again, and then died for it. But all of the things that happened to Sim could have absolutely happened to Trip. They just happened faster. Little Sim told us that he didn't want to be an engineer. He wanted to be a starship captain. He wants to see stuff. And Archer doesn't let him see stuff. Trip is a brilliant engineer, but he isn't only a brilliant engineer. He's out here for a reason. He wants to see the universe. And this episode tells us that if he doesn't get off the ship, he will become a part of it. And he's not okay with that. So that's the first 10 episodes of Season 3 of Star Trek Enterprise. This episode was extra long, so thank you if you are still here. However, for the rest of the season, we are only going to be doing 7 episodes apiece. See you with the next one.